There is a map that sits at the center of American strategic thinking. It shows the alliance architecture: Japan, South Korea, Australia, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. Countries bound to Washington through formal treaties, shared military infrastructure, and 70 years of security guarantees. Countries where American troops are stationed right now on active bases under active defense commitments. That map has not changed in any meaningful way since the Cold War. But there is a second map. Nobody displays it in the same briefing room. Because what the second map shows, and when you look at the actual trade flows, the supply chain dependencies, the investment structures, is a picture that is almost impossible to reconcile with the first one. Most analysis you will encounter on television will not walk you through both maps simultaneously. Not because the data is classified. Every number I am about to use is public. The IMF publishes it. The WTO tracks it. Individual governments report it in their own official annual statistics. But the picture that emerges when you hold those numbers against the alliance architecture is so structurally uncomfortable that the two frames almost never appear in the same conversation. Here is what the second map shows. China has quietly become the dominant economic partner for a substantial portion of the countries that America considers its closest allies. Not through military pressure, not through propaganda or ideology, through trade, through supply chains so deeply embedded in the economic structures of allied nations that unwinding them now costs more than maintaining them. The military alliances are real. The economic map tells a different story. And the gap between those two realities is what this analysis is about. The IMF's 2023 data gives you the scale in two numbers. China is now the largest goods trading partner for 128 countries on Earth. The United States holds that position for 57. Sit with those two numbers for a moment. 128 versus 57. 70 years ago, they ran in the opposite direction. America emerged from World War II as the undisputed center of the global trading system. The Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods institutions, the dollar as global reserve currency. Washington designed a world in which U.S. trade was the gravitational center, and for decades that structure held. What replaced it did not arrive through a single shock or dramatic announcement. It arrived through three mechanisms, each one operating on a different layer of the global economy, each one individually explicable, and together producing a structural outcome that most Western strategic analysis is still struggling to fully absorb. The first mechanism is what I'm going to call the manufacturing anchor. The second is the commodity corridor. The third is the infrastructure bypass. Three levers. Each one was set quietly and over decades. By the time most of America's allies recognized how far the shift had gone, the structure was already load-bearing. Here is where the first lever was set. Most people trace this story to 2001, the year China joined the World Trade Organization. That date matters. But the WTO accession is the moment the acceleration became publicly visible. The actual route goes back to December 1978, and to a decision that most Western economists and policymakers at the time fundamentally underestimated. Jiang Xueqin opened China's economy, not to democracy, not to political liberalization, but to manufacturing capital. His formulation, delivered to the Central Committee that December, was practical to the point of being blunt. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. That is not a metaphor about ideology. That is a manufacturing doctrine. And what it produced over the following 4 decades is the most rapid industrial scaling in modern economic history. China's share of global manufacturing output in 1980 was under 3%, according to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. By 2000, it had crossed 10%. By 2010, it crossed 20%. By 2023, it stood at 28.7%. One country alone now produces more manufactured goods than the United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. When China entered the WTO in 2001, its trajectory was clear to anyone reading the data with care. But what most trade economists in Washington and Brussels failed to model correctly is what happens at the next stage, when the world's most efficient manufacturer becomes the world's largest buyer at the same time. Because that is exactly when the anchor sets. And what gets anchored is the economic structure of the countries that chose to trade with it. But here is the part that almost every analysis of China's trade rise leaves out. And it is the single detail that explains why America's allies didn't just choose to trade with China. They built economic structures that now make reversing course materially painful and, in certain sectors, structurally impossible. And the country that handed China the conditions to make that happen was the United States itself. South Korea and Japan are two of the most strategically significant security relationships the United States has anywhere on Earth. South Korea hosts 28,500 U.S. troops. Japan hosts approximately 55,000. Both are covered by America's extended nuclear deterrence. Both are central to American strategic planning for Asia in a way that no other countries are. Both signed formal mutual defense treaties with Washington that remain fully active today. By 2023, China was the largest single trading partner for both of them. South Korea's goods trade with China reached $310 billion in 2022, according to the Korea International Trade Association, more than South Korea's combined trade with the United States and Japan. Japan's trade with China crossed $370 billion in 2022, according to Japan's Ministry of Finance. That relationship survived a territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands, multiple diplomatic confrontations, and years of sustained nationalist pressure in both countries. Because the manufacturing anchor does not respond to political sentiment, it responds to cost structures and supply chain integration. Here is how the mechanism actually works. China did not position itself primarily as the seller of finished goods to America's allies. It positioned itself at the center of their production processes, components, intermediate inputs, the materials and subassemblies that flow into products that other countries then finish and sell under their own brands. Apple's devices are designed in California and marketed globally, but the component ecosystem that makes them possible, display glass, acoustic parts, certain board-level assemblies, runs through a Chinese supplier network that Apple has spent 15 years and enormous capital trying to partially diversify, with limited structural success. South Korean semiconductor firms, Samsung, SK Hynix, are among the most advanced chip makers on Earth. They depend on Chinese suppliers for specific upstream chemicals and substrates that are not yet available in comparable volume from alternative sources. Japanese precision manufacturers, companies producing the equipment used in chip fabrication globally, have supply chain touchpoints in Chinese industrial zones that cannot be quickly relocated. Not because the will is absent, because the alternatives have not been built at scale. Once that level of integration is established, the economic cost of removing it becomes staggering. Not theoretically, but concretely and measurably, in lost production capacity, in transition costs, in the time required to develop substitute supply chains. The British Empire ran a structurally similar system in the 19th century. Britain didn't need to formally govern its trading partners to generate dependency. It made itself indispensable to their production processes. Australian wool, Indian cotton, Canadian wheat, all routed through British commercial and financial infrastructure. The political independence of those nations was real. The economic dependency was load-bearing. When Britain lost its economic centrality after the First World War, then decisively after the Second, it lost the structural foundation of its global power long before it lost the formal territories. That is not a decorative historical parallel. It is the template that explains the current structure. Now, the commodity corridor. The second mechanism. And this is where the dependency reaches into sectors that every one of America's allies currently describes as a strategic national priority. There are 17 rare earth elements. They appear in electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, missile guidance systems, medical imaging equipment, and smartphone displays. There is no credible clean energy transition without them. There is no modern military supply chain without them. China controls 60% of global rare earth mining and, more critically, 85% of global rare earth processing capacity, according to the U.S. Geological Survey as of 2024. Processing is the step that converts raw ore into material that manufacturers can actually use. A country can mine rare earths on its own soil and still depend on Chinese facilities to make those materials functional. Australia has substantial deposits. Japan has been deliberately building independent processing capacity for over a decade. As of 2024, Japan's domestic rare earth processing capacity compared to China's sites at roughly 1 to 8, according to the Japan Organization for Metals and Energy Security. 1 to 8, after a decade of sustained, deliberate effort. And this is where the cost of living for ordinary people in allied countries enters the story, directly and specifically. The electric vehicles that Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom are all committed to producing at scale as part of their stated climate commitments and their industrial strategies require lithium-ion batteries. China controls approximately 76% of global lithium-ion battery manufacturing capacity as of 2023, according to Bloomberg NEF. The second and third largest producers, South Korea and Japan, depend on Chinese suppliers for key upstream battery materials. Every EV on a European road, every wind turbine an allied nation installs, every precision-guided weapon a NATO member stocks. The supply chains for all of them run at critical structural points through Chinese industrial capacity. That is not a projected future risk. That is the current architecture. Here is the part that nobody on television will say plainly, and the reason they will not say it is precisely the reason you need to hear it. The decoupling that Washington announced, that Brussels endorsed, that Tokyo pledged support for, it exists almost entirely on paper, and the numbers document exactly why. The third mechanism, the infrastructure bypass, is the one that most Western strategic analysis consistently underestimates. And it is the mechanism that converts a trading relationship into something that begins to function like structural alignment, regardless of what the formal alliance documents say. Between 2013 and 2023, China committed more than $1 trillion in infrastructure financing across 147 countries, according to the Aid Data Research Lab at William & Mary, documented in their 2023 Global Chinese Development Finance dataset. Roads, ports, railways, power plants, 5G telecommunications networks. Most of the public coverage focuses on the developing world, Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, Pakistan's Gwadar corridor, Kenya's standard gauge railway. The narrative is familiar. Debt traps, dependency, leverage over smaller nations. But the infrastructure penetration of America's formal treaty allies is the story that receives less public attention, and it is the one with more lasting strategic consequence. Italy became the first G7 nation to formally join the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019. Rome cited infrastructure investment and expanded trade access. Washington expressed direct concern. NATO members objected. Italy withdrew formally from the BRI in 2023 under sustained political pressure, but the commercial infrastructure projects initiated during the accession period were not reversed by the formal withdrawal. The business relationships built did not simply close when the political declaration was retracted. Chinese state-linked companies are party to port operations in 11 European Union member states. The most documented example is Greece's Piraeus port, the largest port in the Mediterranean and a critical logistics node for European and global trade. COSCO, a Chinese state enterprise, acquired a majority operational stake in Piraeus in 2016. By 2021, Piraeus had become the second busiest container port in Europe by volume. That economic transformation is fully documented. The strategic reality, Chinese commercial infrastructure embedded at a critical transit point in NATO's southern flank, is not an inference. It is the observable record. Before the next part, something deserves a complete stop. The countries most affected by these structural dependencies are not abstractions. South Korea is 52 million people, with a living memory of devastating war, who built an export-dependent economy that now relies significantly on Chinese market access and Chinese supply chain integration. Japan's manufacturers employ millions of workers in communities across the Japanese archipelago, workers whose livelihoods depend on supply chain relationships that route through Chinese industrial zones. German industrial workers in the Ruhr Valley, in Bavaria, in Baden-Württemberg built their careers and their communities on a manufacturing model that cannot be restructured without transition costs that fall on them first, not on the policymakers designing the restructuring from offices in Berlin or Brussels. When Washington and Brussels discuss decoupling, they are describing a structural disruption that would be felt most immediately by the workers and communities of the allies they are claiming to protect. Those people are rarely in these conversations. They should be. Now, the gap between official statements and observable reality. Here is what official Washington says. America is leading a strategic decoupling from China. The CHIPS Act, signed in August 2022, commits $52.7 billion to reshoring semiconductor manufacturing. Export controls on advanced chips, enacted in October 2022 and significantly tightened in October 2023, restrict China's access to critical semiconductor technology. The Inflation Reduction Act creates domestic incentives for clean energy manufacturing on American soil. These are real policy moves. The resources are real. The political commitment has been genuine. Here is what the trade data says. Total U.S.-China goods trade, the actual physical flow of products across the border, reached $575 billion in 2023, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. That number is down from its peak, but it remains the largest bilateral goods trade volume between any two countries in the world that formally describe each other as strategic competitors. Among America's allies, the gap between the stated strategy and the structural reality is even more pronounced. Japan-China trade remained above $300 billion in 2023. South Korea-China trade stayed above $280 billion. Germany's trade with China, despite a formal government strategy explicitly calling for de-risking and multiple official statements about reducing dependency, declined only marginally in 2023, remaining above $250 billion, according to Germany's Federal Statistical Office. The gap between the announced decoupling and the observable trade flows is not a communications failure. It is not a policy implementation delay that more funding or more political will can close quickly. It is the structural signature of load-bearing dependency, the kind that does not yield to political declarations because the economic cost of actual removal structurally exceeds the political cost of continuation. The Peterson Institute for International Economics assessed this directly as of March 2024. Their probability estimate for meaningful structural decoupling between America's core allies and China over the next decade, below 25%. Not because the political will is entirely absent, because the economic architecture makes the cost of doing it prohibitively high. Step back from the specific numbers for a moment, because here is what the manufacturing anchor, the commodity corridor, and the infrastructure bypass, taken together, actually mean for the strategic choices that America's allies will face in the next crisis. And the honest picture, when you hold all three in the same frame, is different from what either side of the political debate is willing to say out loud. The counterargument deserves a serious and honest hearing, because there are analysts, credentialed, serious analysts, who look at everything I have described and arrive somewhere much calmer. Their argument is this: trade dependency is not automatically strategic vulnerability. Japan and China have been each other's largest trading partners for most of the past 2 decades, and they remain geopolitical adversaries with active territorial disputes. Economic interdependency can function as a stabilizing force. That was the logic underpinning the entire post-war liberal trading order that America itself designed and championed. If all parties are economically entangled, the cost of conflict becomes prohibitive for everyone. Trade as peace. The argument has genuine intellectual weight. It animated American policy toward China for 40 years, from Nixon's 1972 opening through multiple administrations of both parties. And it fails on one specific structural point. It assumes the entanglement is symmetric, that both sides bear equivalent costs from disruption. The empirical record of the last decade demonstrates clearly that it is not symmetric. When China restricted Australian barley imports in 2020, in direct retaliation for Australia's call for an independent COVID-19 origins inquiry, Australia's agricultural export sector absorbed a genuine economic shock. When China suspended Lithuanian beef and dairy imports in 2021, in retaliation for Lithuania permitting Taiwan to open a representative office under its own name, Lithuania's export sector took a measurable and documented hit. When China restricted Norwegian salmon imports in 2010, following the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo, Norway felt it directly and immediately. China, in each case, absorbed minimal domestic disruption. That asymmetry, the pattern in which trade pressure imposed by China costs the other party structurally more than it costs China, is the defining feature of the system that has been constructed over 3 decades. So what should you take from this? Not alarm. Alarm is not useful here. What is useful is the second map, the actual map. Because when you understand the genuine economic structure that underlies the alliance architecture, you stop being confused by the behavior that follows from it. You understand why allied governments issue strong statements and then continue trading. You understand why decoupling is announced repeatedly and delivered incompletely. You understand the structural logic of what is happening, and that clarity is considerably more useful than treating each instance as a puzzle or a betrayal. Watch 3 things going forward. Watch rare earth processing capacity building in non-Chinese countries. If it reaches commercial scale faster than current projections, the commodity corridor begins to lose its structural grip. Watch whether Germany's industrial recovery routes around Chinese supply chains or back through them. That answer will tell you whether the de-risking rhetoric is becoming structural reality or remaining political theater. And watch the decisions that allied governments make the next time a concrete security demand from Washington conflicts directly with a concrete economic cost to their industries. That intersection, where the 2 maps collide, is where the real strategic picture becomes undeniable. The quiet pivot was not a dramatic event. It was a structural accumulation, one supply chain, one trade deal, one port investment at a time over decades in plain sight of institutions that were watching it happen and largely chose to describe each data point as manageable rather than structural. The people who see both maps clearly will navigate what comes next with considerably more accuracy than those working from only one. Someone has to say it out loud. Now you know.